Does that do it? Ha! It's working. All
Awesome.
right. Okay, awesome. So we are gathered here today to talk about reviews for our mobile application for the Zooniverse. And I think that y'all are familiar with this app to some degree, but essentially this is our mobile app that allows our community to do classifications on various scientific research projects on their mobile phone. The app got started, I think, in like 2015, and we just got a grant from NASA to continue work on it, which is really exciting. The focus of this engagement is going to be galvanizing the app for maintainability. So rather than adding a lot of new features, what we're going to do is go in and make some changes that hopefully will make the app easier to add features to moving forward. So a little bit on the history of this app is that it was started in 2015 by one developer. And then when that developer left, the app went sort of undeveloped for a little while. And then another developer came in and worked on it for a couple of years. And then that developer left and it went kind of undeveloped for a little while. And then I came in and I started working on it. We're going to talk a little bit today about the implications of that development cycle for a mobile app from like a context sharing perspective. But from a technical perspective, what that means is that there has not been a means of preserving continuity between the development styles and assumptions and understandings of the three developers. And so now we have an app that it works. It is somewhat legible, but there are a lot of things that we can do to make the app more maintainable moving forward. For example, things like test coverage are going to be important for this. Things like documentation are a priority that we would like to address. And even in some cases in the code, we have code that can be cleaned up. It can be made more concise. There are cases of functional duplication where we can make it easier to add things in the future. So a good example of this is with our workflows. We have 4 workflows that we support in the application right now. We support swipe, we support single answer questions, multi-answer questions, and we support drawing rectangles. There are other kinds of tasks that we would like to add to the app. We'd like to add drawing a bespoke shape to the app. We'd like to add audio to the app. But right now, the way that that code is written is we have 4 completely separate classes representing each workflow, which is fine, but they're like a lot of them do have things that they do almost the exact same way, and you'll see why I say almost in a second, that really they should do the exact same way. So for example, depending on which workflow you go to, the buttons will be like in different orders and that kind of thing. So we'd like to make that consistent. And because there are those things that are really supposed to be the same for all of them, it would make sense to extract that out, which then gives another developer less that they have to understand in order to add another workflow to the app. So that's an example of something we'd like to do. Another example of something that we'd like to do is add some logging to the application, because right now it's kind of a mystery when bugs happen in prod, what happened. We have to kind of guess at it. The I guess, famous example at this point being that when we made museum mode and we put the app on the floor in the Adler, we found this bug that was coming through, or we had this exception that was coming through all the time. And in order to figure out what it was, we had to do a little bit of mystery solving that was related to which of the 2 iPads. Shaun, have you heard this story?
I have not. I'm just curious to see how this is going to be solved.
Yeah. So we have an iPad installed at about 4 feet high for adults to do classifications. We have an iPad at about 2.5 feet high for children to do classifications. And what we realized was that the exception was happening far, far more often on the children height iPad than the adult height iPad. And it turned out the reason was that there was a button that you were supposed to press once and then wait for the call to finish and then keep classifying. And kids would just mash it and it was crashing that way. Which it's like a funny story, but if we had like some logs beyond what the actual exception was, then it would have been like, we wouldn't have had to do that. It's like a funny story, but sometimes you don't always have access. Like in some cases where we're working on the application, this was a special case where We could actually go up to the floor and observe what people were doing. We had both devices in the same place and we knew information about them. So that helped us resolve the issue in this case. But in most cases, we don't have that advantage. It's all different devices all over the world by people that we don't know. And so having some additional exception tracking would be really, really helpful there. So that's an example of things we're going to do. So I just wanted to give you the context on sort of what we're hoping to achieve with this grant. Ideally, what we would like to do is get the app into an extremely maintainable state so that it's easier to add features in the future, it's easier to figure out what's wrong, those kinds of things. We have another goal with this engagement. This one's, I'm going to say a stretch goal, not because we don't think we can hit it, but because this is the kind of goal that can require a long time to invest in. And I think it can produce a really good return for us, but it will require some investment of time and effort up front. And that's what we're working on within this grant. The idea is to make the mobile app a place where developers from outside of the Zooniverse can contribute to the Zooniverse code base. And there are a couple of reasons for that. And the first one has to do with sort of the mission of the Zooniverse, and the other one has to do with some of the technical things on the application. So the first one, of course, we know the mission of the Zooniverse is to make it so that anybody can get involved in scientific research. And it is a platform that exists precisely to democratize contribution to scientific research. So I think it makes a lot of sense from a mission perspective for us to have an application where we have the opportunity to focus on democratizing technical contributions as well. We'd also be in a really unique space insofar as that as developers are learning, they're told make open source contributions. But the thing is, what most developers are learning to do is build client applications like React Native applications, Ruby on Rails applications, those kinds of things. But a lot of the high profile open source projects are libraries and frameworks, which is good, but those are the types of code bases where a developer, first of all, it's completely different from what developers are often learning to write. And second of all, perhaps pursuant to that, the type of developer who, like, in order to get your contributions in on a code base like that, it's really helpful to have a lot more experience, both technically and from the perspective of collaborating with other people. And so more junior developers are encouraged to contribute to open source applications, or rather to open source code. But open source code, the way it's currently like mostly used, doesn't really give them a chance to engage in a way that they are like learning about. And so this gives us a chance to create something like that for them. The next thing is the technical part, which is essentially that right now, I described the history a little bit, the development history of the mobile application. And the result of that having been that each time a developer stops working on it, a lot of context about the app is lost. I tend to picture context of developing some code sort of like, you can imagine it like a beach ball. And so the context is a beach ball, and who we can think of people as holding the beach ball, as having the beach ball, or the beach ball being dropped on the ground. So when somebody has context on an application, you can picture them holding this beach ball, holding this context. And when they want to give context to somebody else, they can pass that context, they can hand it over such that the context is always held. Now, if somebody leaves and doesn't pass that context on to somebody else, that's the equivalent of them putting the beach ball on the ground. So then the beach ball is on the ground, all of the context is there. And if the beach ball stays on the ground for long enough, if that context is left abandoned for long enough, eventually the winds of time and change will blow the beach ball into the ocean or into the woods. It'll be lost. And then we have to get a new beach ball. The next developer has to come along and they have to develop all the context on that application from scratch, which is doable, but it takes additional time and effort, and it can sometimes be frustrating. And ideally, we wouldn't necessarily have to do that. Now, the short term, the sort of like solution to that is to make sure that people are sharing context such that on any given team, multiple people have a hand on that beach ball at one time. So that if somebody has to let go, they get a new job, or they have a life event come up and they need to step away for a little while, somebody else is hanging on to that beach ball and it's not going to get blown into the ocean. And that's the advantage that we get from things like pair programming. I've paired some with Will on this application, and then code review. So the idea here is that not only will y'all be able to help me and make my code better, but I can also pass this beach ball to you in some respects so that you have context on the mobile application too. And if something were to come up, suppose that like I were out for a day and something comes up and something needs to be hot fixed, hopefully that doesn't happen. But if it happens and it's really urgent, then y'all will be as capable of doing the hot fix as I would be, because you have the context, you have the beach ball just like I do. So how does this relate to open source contributions? Well, now I want you to picture, and I know that this is going to be stressful because it's COVID times, but just bear with me for a second. I want you to picture a big crowd of people all close together at a concert, okay? That's what happens when you have an open source community. Now imagine that the singer on stage goes backstage and he gets a beach ball and he blows it up and he throws it into the crowd. No individual person is responsible for hanging on to that beach ball, but because there are so many people so close together, they start playing this game where they set the beach ball up into the air and it sets all over the crowd and it never hits the ground because everybody's there and they're holding up that beach ball together. That's what an open source contribution community gives us, such that even if all three of us had to step away, a hot fix probably isn't the right example, but suppose that there was a feature we really wanted to add to the app and the three of us were just occupied. We had other high priority things and we couldn't get around to it. We would then have the opportunity to say to our open source community, hey, there's this thing we'd absolutely love to build, but we just don't have the resources right now to get around to it. They would have the context that they needed to do something like that and get the feature into the application sooner than if we were responsible for it alone. And so that's kind of the theory behind the code review. And it's also the theory behind having the open source contributor community. Does all that make sense?
Makes sense so far?
Rock on. Cool. So the ways that we transfer context in teams are typically pairing and code review. I'm happy to pair if y'all are ever interested. I'm also planning on live streaming large parts of the development of this application, in part so that an open source community would have stuff to refer back to, and also just to like get the word out there, because I tend to think of developing code similar to building a house. Like we get the materials, right? And we start to build this house. And when we get the house finished once we have the materials, it's entirely dependent on our work. The more hours we put in on a given day, the fewer days it's going to take for us to get the house built. But growing a community is not like building a house. It's like growing a garden. It takes effort, but it also takes time. So no matter how much time any of us puts in on a given day into building publicity for the application, ultimately, some of that has to grow organically. People have to have time to come to the application, to learn about it. They need to be able to see me working on it so that it's not intimidating. They need to get to see the way that the code looks. And so I don't expect that by the end of this engagement, we're going to have a full giant open source community for this application. But some of the groundwork will have been laid through the live streaming and through kind of publicizing our work on the application to start to generate some interest. So hopefully we'll have some seedlings popping up out of the ground, metaphorically, at the end of this engagement, such that ultimately, when we're ready to harvest the sunflower seeds have grown, the sunflowers have grown, and we have like sunflowers to harvest seeds from. So goals of the engagement, goals of pairing, goals of code review. So code review. This is how I am going to pass context to you. And because of that, I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about code review and like what ends up being productive with code review in my experience. And I'm interested to hear your experiences on this as well. But there are a couple of different versions of code review that we can use. One of them is pair programming, and this is synchronous code review, by which I mean two developers are working on the code base at the same time. The nice thing about synchronous code review or pair programming is that both of you usually have your hands on the keyboard and you're working in the code at a given time, which means both of you have the context on how to run the application, how to maintain the application, and you're talking with each other about changes that could potentially be made. So if person A starts to do something and person B says, well, why don't we try it this way? Person A can say, oh, I'm not really sure how that would look. Can you demonstrate? And person B can say, yeah, sure. I think it would look something like this. So we don't have those things automatically the same way with asynchronous code review, which is something like a pull request, where one person writes the code and then another person goes in and reviews the code. That can be just as useful for making the code better and transferring context, but it does require a little bit more concerted effort for person A and person B. So we'll say I'm person A in this situation because I'm writing code that I put in a pull request for you to look at. I'm responsible for making sure that that pull request contains all of the context that you need to be able to make informed judgments about this application. My pull request should provide enough context that you can run the application, that you can navigate around the application, you understand the goals of this PR, and you understand my goals in writing it. So, for example, in a good description for a pull request review, I would probably say something along the lines of, this PR is designed to address this feature and add this thing for our community. So you know what the pull request is for. And then I might say, this is in response to such and such bug fix or such and such feature. And so you understand sort of where the motivation is coming from. And then I would say, my goals with this PR are to make this portion of the code legible, make this portion of the code visible to like Sentry or one of our other exception tracking things or something like that. And I'm really interested in your feedback on whether the names are clear or whether you see any additional duplication that maybe I should pull out, or whether there's a better way to do this in JavaScript that you think would be more intuitive than what I've done or something like that. So I'm generally going to start at the very high level. This is what we're doing. This is what's in this pull request. This is why we did this pull request. And then I'll drop down and say, these are the goals of this code. And these were my goals while I was writing the code so that you kind of understand where I was coming from with that code. And that gives you the opportunity to say, well, I know that Chelsea's goal was to make this part clear with the names, and this name I'm not really sure about. And so I would suggest maybe something else here. So my goal with submitting my pull request is to make it easier for you to understand the code and figure out what's going to be the most useful things to zone in on in that code. So that's my goal. That's what you can expect from me in a pull request. If you get a pull request from me and you're asked to review it and the description doesn't have everything you need to be able to do that, I want you to feel empowered to tell me that. I am perfectly happy to go in, answer questions, add more context, do all of those things. It's really important to me that my pull requests make it as easy for you as possible to run and analyze and understand this code and to make suggestions in it. Does that make sense so far? Awesome.
I have just a real quick question, or you can, I don't know if if it's going to come up later or not. We could just skip until then. But in the PR review, is there like linkage or instruction on like testing different devices, or like, I don't know if we use browser stack or not, or if, because like I feel like such a key part of using the app is like testing it like on different iPhone versions and different like Android versions. I'm not sure if, I just don't have like personal familiarity with if we do use browser stack or if there's other ways that we test it
Yeah,
on different
totally.
devices.
Totally. So generally, the way that I'll run tests on things is that I'll run iOS simulator and an Android emulator, both on my computer. And then I'll run the app on both of those, and the simulator and the emulator. So before I send you pull request reviews, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but essentially what I would love first is to get y'all up to speed on that process of running the application. Because then, so pull request reviews, this actually dovetails nicely because we've talked about what you can expect from me with a pull request review, with a pull request. And now I'll talk a little bit about my expectations for a review. So I'm really excited to get your pull request reviews because I'm really interested in getting some alternate perspectives on this code base. This code base has been developed at a given time by either 0 developers or 1 developer. And I'm really excited to see that change. That having been said, I've seen a number of different strategies for pull request reviews, and there are some that help and some that help a lot and some that help not so much. So with a pull request review, particularly with something like GitHub that provides a UI that shows you all the code changes, it can be really easy to go in and look at the files that changed and like add drive-by commentary on the code without running it. And that is, in my experience, not a particularly helpful strategy. And I'll explain like a little bit about why. So let me use an example. And we're going to say in these examples, we're going to start with a baseline of everybody's being very kind and not hurling insults everywhere, which sometimes also happens on pull request reviews, but I don't think it's going to happen with us. But one thing that'll sometimes happen is someone will say, you know, I see that you did blah here. Did you consider some alternate approach? And they'll name sort of a vague alternate approach, but here's what happens in a case like that. I have a choice to make. I can choose to ignore that feedback, which I would prefer, of course, not to do because this person might be onto something. But that type of feedback, what it does is it puts all of the responsibility for testing the idea of person B on person A, which means that if that idea doesn't work, I sunk a bunch of time researching and trying it out. And it's possible even that there was a miscommunication and I didn't even understand very clearly what person B was suggesting that I do. So what that vague suggestion does is it puts all of the risk for the suggestion not working on the original developer, and all of the credit, if it does work, on the reviewer, which what that imbalance does is it pushes the original developer who submitted the pull request review, like the motivation there pushes the original developer towards ignoring those types of suggestions. And ideally, the original developer is not ignoring those types of suggestions because the whole point of code review is to get other people's opinions about how the code might work. And so when I'm reviewing a pull request, I challenge myself to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm pulling down the code and I'm running it. So I'm making sure that it works. Second of all, I'm making sure that I understand the goals of this because I'm putting myself in the original developer's shoes and I'm saying, if I needed to do this, if I became responsible for this code base, how would I go about making this change? And I'm thinking about that as I go through their changes. So then third, if there's something that I would like them to change, then I will try, rather than providing it as sort of like a general idea or even pseudocode, I'll try to provide the exact code if I can. So an example of this might be, I'll switch over to another project. We had a script that was using pandas that another developer at the Zooniverse was working on. And he's a very experienced developer and he's got experience in Python, but the pandas library specifically was not his specialty. And the pandas library is something that I've worked with a lot. And so he had a solution that worked, but there were a couple of things that could be done to make it a little more legible and a little more efficient. So in those cases, I shared with him code verbatim in the comments, like, you've done this and it works, but you can save some cycles if you do, the code verbatim line. And I changed the line in my version of the code to make sure that I was telling him the right thing. And then I put that into the review. Now, there are a couple of options here, of course. One of them is I could just make a commit directly and add it onto his branch. And then he doesn't have to go in and copy and paste the stuff in. versus doing it in the comments on the pull request review. So let me talk about those two things. The reason that I would put it in the, well, let me go over the benefits and drawbacks of each. So if I were to make a commit and put it on top of his branch and say, here, I made some changes to the Panda stuff, it should make it run more efficiently.
That's a great way to make friends.
It is, yeah, well, so precisely. It does the work for him, so he doesn't have to do the work, but it doesn't explain why I made those changes, so I'm not helping him understand. And depending on the relative level of power of the two developers in the organization, it can feel like the reviewer is like stealing the opportunity to write this code from the original developer. In this particular case on this mobile app, I'm not worried about that. So if you want to make changes directly and then add commits onto my branch or make your own branch, that's perfectly fine. I give you explicit permission. However, if I were reviewing the code of a developer who has a couple years experience and they got the opportunity to work on this project, and this is like their plum project, they're so excited to work on this, they're so proud of what they've done, and then I go, oh, here, I fixed it for you, and I push I commit and I like changed everything, that's gonna make them feel like their work wasn't valuable, like I just redid all their work from scratch. And so in those cases, I will tend to I will err on the side of changing the code with like a comment in the review rather than pushing it directly. So I avoid making somebody feel like I didn't value the work that they originally did. In this specific case, you are welcome to like change things in my code and push commits. I'm fine with that. But in general, I don't default to that, and that's why. So then let's see what else. I'll try to make the changes on my end. I'll try to push it. I'll also try to explain like why I think a certain change is better. And the idea behind me as a submitter telling you my specific goals is so that you can use those as hooks to explain things and say things like, well, you know, you mentioned that you wanted it to be clear. I thought this part wasn't clear. I thought this other thing might be clearer. So that gives us an opportunity to talk about code, not in terms of good versus bad, but in terms of legible versus confusing, or concise versus verbose, or performant versus kind of slow. And then we can talk about the individual qualities of the code and keep the conversation in the direction of like, how do we together make this code base as effective at accomplishing its goals as it can be, as opposed to that makes it a little less stressful for us to communicate because nobody feels like they're telling somebody their code is bad. Does that make sense? Cool. I think that might be honestly all that I have on pull request submission and review, unless y'all have questions.
I do have questions. I should make some notes here. Let's see. Obviously, the number one thing that's going to be me and Mark and me asking, like, we need to get a setup for on our machines so we can actually run the Android emulator. I think I ran the Android emulator like once a long time ago, and if I try to do it now, it's going to spout about 32 different messages about like, you need to update to the latest Windows version on the Mac.
Oh,
so
yeah.
So that's probably like that, but that's aside. This is a technical thing. So one of the things that I would like to ask you personally is like, in addition to expectations for like, you want us to share our opinions, like give clear ideas like how we can improve the code together. Also, I want to get an idea of like what are expectations for timeline, for example. Here's an example of what I mean, because I have Will review a bunch of his code for the Alice text editor. So he tends to have a lot of PRs at the same time. Some in draft mode, some are not ready, and it's never clear what it is. So sometimes I don't look at it until like every 2 weeks or so. Mm-hmm. But Will is comfortable to just ping me, Shaun, this PR 1137, 1159 is going to be a priority. Can you please do it as soon as you can? And I go like, sure. Yeah. But if it's also he doesn't tell me like review all of this by the end of the week, because he knows I'm very busy with everything else as well. But at the same time, he's not shy to go like, I need your help for this 2 PRs ASAP. So like, mm-hmm. Cool. So what are your expectations for this?
Yeah. So I really like that idea. I could absolutely do that. We could even use tags on the pull request, and I could tag certain ones priority and then let you know these are priority. These need to go in versus this other thing, not as important. Does that make sense? We could do it that way. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then if there's going to be a particular week when you're not going to have time, just let me know and I could absolutely work around that. Because this, you know, all of these are going to be maintainability changes. And so hopefully a lot of them will be really flexible and when they get in there. So that's,
Awesome.
yeah, totally. Then on running the application. So of course, if you want to be able to test whether changes work on the code base, you need to be able to run the code base. So there are a couple of different things for that. When you get the chance, and I'm happy to like wait on putting you as a reviewer to a PR until you get the opportunity to do this, because I know people have other projects and stuff going on. I would love for you to pull down the mobile app and see if you can get it running. Now we have a README that should help with this. And I've done a couple things in the README. It explains how to run stuff on Android, how to run stuff on iOS. And then there are a couple of troubleshooting sections in there, which is like, if you get this specific error, run this command line command. And so hopefully that'll do it. That's my hope. If that does not work, I'm happy to set aside time to pair with you and like personally help you get up and running with the mobile application on Android and on iOS as well, because I want you to be able to check it on both of those things. So I'm happy to spend as much time as you need getting this thing up and running with you, because I do think getting it up and running is going to be really important for reviewing those PRs. But yeah, in terms of priority on that, just let me know when is going to work for you. And I'll do it let me know when is going to work for you, and I'll hang on to PRs until you're like able to get that running, or I can help you get it running, whatever's going to be easiest there. But I do want to make sure that you have all of that figured out, so I'm not like leaving you in the lurch where like I ask you for a review on a PR and it's a priority, but you can't get the app running. In those situations, like we're not going to end up in that situation, because I won't put you as a reviewer until you've got the app running, and I'll help you until you've got the app running if that's needed. That makes sense? Oh, gone. I think that might honestly be all I have. So what questions do y'all have? I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah, or anything. But
Are the videos that you've recorded, are they linked on in the repo, or is it, I think, are they your, I can't remember if they're, I know I've seen like one or two a while ago, but I can't remember if I bookmarked it or if.
yeah, you know what I can do? They're
just in
not
the
linked in the
channel.
README to the repo, but they probably should be somewhere, at least in the mobile wiki. So that's a good point. I can send you those links as well, or I can put them in the mobile channel in the Slack so that y'all have access to them. There's one in particular. It's an 8-minute video that's just like, this is what the mobile app is. And now that I think about it, it might be, you might already know everything in that video, but I'll send it to you anyway. And then I can also say like which videos I think will be the most useful for understanding the technical structure of the application, because there are some where I'm doing like work with the config and stuff, and those are probably not as informative, versus the ones where I'm building museum mode. That's probably pretty informative because I'm working directly with the workflows in those videos.
Cool.
Yeah.
A bit more of one more question about the mobile development itself, because so you got a NASA grant. So number one, we are going to make the code itself more maintainable. And number two, as you pointed out, this is the part, this is fairly new to me until you actually explained it. It's like we want to grow more of an open source crowd around the code, which is what we have in Zooniverse in theory, but not really in practice.
Right.
So you said the word a few times, engagement.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit more about what you mean by how you're trying to engage more developers to come in and join this open source community?
Yeah, totally. So this is a great question because it's one that I'm still kind of figuring out as we go. It's it's a tough one, getting folks engaged in an open source project. And my hope is to create an on-ramp to open source contribution that will be available to developers who have only done client applications or don't have, as much experience as your average core contributor to React or something like that. And so the first thing is to try to create opportunities that don't necessarily require them to get full context on the code and start making changes right away. So the live streaming is one of the big methods that I'm hoping to use for that. So far, the live streams have been kind of like just whenever I happen to be working and I don't announce them ahead of time. But moving forward, I'd like to change that. So I'd like to make it either so they're pre-announced or so that live streams are happening at a particular time every week. And that's going to give folks the opportunity to know when it is, and then they can come in and they don't have to understand the whole code base right away. They don't have to write code right away, but they can look at what I'm doing. They can comment on what I'm doing, and they can ask me questions so that I can serve as sort of a guide to the code base as I'm going through and making the changes that I would typically have to make. One drawback of having a set time, of course, is that if I have a set time, then I have to stream kind of like whatever I happen to be doing during that time. And there are going to be weeks when that's like backlog grooming or something. It's not always going to be like fun feature development. But I think that that might be, that cost might be worth the benefit. And I also think it's possible that potential open source contributors would find that interesting too. Like in addition to coding, they might be interested in like, how are we setting priorities for the application? Why do you care so much about logging? Why does it matter that the workflows be live inside of like a common framework or something like that? So we'll see. This is all very much an experiment, and it's possible it won't work. It's possible need to try other things. So I'm very interested in your ideas on that. But that's sort of the first experiment, and I'm interested to see what else we can do to get developers interested in the project. So if you have ideas, I'd love to hear them now or later.
There's that Hacktoberfest event like every October that GitHub runs. I don't know how we submit a repo to that or not. I don't know. It like put in the back of our heads. I don't know if.
That's a good point. Yeah, Will also mentioned in the Slack channel some sort of like website that has like links to apps looking for open source contributions and that kind of thing. And so I'm interested to take a look at that. For those types of things, I like the idea of Hacktoberfest, particularly because it would give me a deadline to get like the test coverage and the documentation in place, you know? So
deadlines are good and bad.
yeah, they make a lovely whooshing sound as they fly by. But it does, you know, it's nice to have a little urgency for something like that. Definitely documentation and test coverage would be important for that, particularly just like getting the app up and running. I wonder if we could find an even easier way than a README to help people get it up locally, but we might look into that. I do have a question for y'all. So we are recording this meeting so that Will will be able to look at it. And I want you to feel completely free to say no to this. We will still be friends and everything. But I was thinking about putting the recording of this meeting on the YouTube channel with the live streams. Would you be okay with that? You would? Rock on. I can tag you on Twitter. You'll be famous.
I'm so good. I muted when I made that joke. But yes, I said, sure, okay.
Good. Excellent. Awesome. Well, I'm happy to answer more questions for the next 18 minutes, or if you don't have any other questions, I'm happy to give you your time back so you can spend a little more time coding today.
I've got one heck of a bug to solve with some backend stuff. I have no idea how I'm going to solve, how to handle weird server stuff. Give me front end anytime, any day of week, please.
Oh man, that's awesome.
Cool. Good luck, Shaun.
Thank you.
Best of luck, for real. All right. Well, I will gift you then these 15 minutes to take a look at that. And yeah, I don't know. Ping me if you have anything else. I'm happy to answer.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chelsea.
All right. Yeah, it was great to see y'all. All right. Have a good one.
All right, cool. I'll post some of my notes from this conversation on the mobile channel. That would be our main part of the conversation. But yeah. But anyway, other than that, see you later.
Rock on. Have a good one, Shaun.